Plato said that there are ideas and forms which belong to the realm of heaven, and then there's the material world here on earth. And what we do is we actually bring heaven down to earth through ideas. The idea is eternal and the material is finite, man. So in other words, if you think of the form of a chair, the form of a chair in your mind is perfect and it's eternal, but as soon as you bring it into a physical form, the chair deteriorates over time. It's not actually perfect. Like if you sit on it, it doesn't really, it's not a perfect chair, but in your mind, the form is perfect. And I think that's just an interesting thing to think about. Ideas and these things, you know, we think about cell phones, we think about, these are all things that we improvise in our minds, man. They're products of people's imaginations and thoughts. Exactly. So we need to use our imaginations. And what we do is we bring heaven down to earth, because the imagination was something which God gave us. Because God is the creator. Actually, when we are surrendering to that creative process, we are bringing a piece of God and a piece of heaven down to earth. That's why in the Lord's Prayer it says, may your kingdom come and your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And that's why Jesus said that the same spirit that lives in me lives in you. The same spirit that lives in him lives in us. I spoke about the origin. Origin is very important because the origin is what grounds everything. The music of a place is created by the people in that environment. It's an expression of who those people are in a particular location on earth. So it's the origin of something is very important, and the origin of everything that we create is actually from God. I received the Hugh Masekela Scholarship in 2019. It was a very spur of the moment opportunity that I got because it was something that I didn't plan. And like with jazz, it's something that you feel intuitively. I heard about the scholarship and I didn't even give it a second thought. I just thought, okay, I'm gonna audition for this thing. I didn't plan what I was gonna play. I didn't plan who was gonna play on my audition. All I knew was I had to send in 3 songs. I think the next day after I heard about it, I called 3 guys. I called my very good friends Blake, Tefo, and Sean. And I just said, you know what? I'm gonna play All the Things You Are. It's a song I know very well. I'm gonna play one of my own tunes. I think there's 2 chords in that entire song. And myself and Blake recorded a ballad, Dawn That Dream. That was probably all of 20 minutes. Not something that germinated in my mind for a long time. It wasn't something that I thought about. I literally just responded to something intuitive. The interesting thing about that was that I ended up getting a full scholarship. It includes living costs, it includes tuition and accommodation and everything. So that's an amazing opportunity. Why I'm saying this in this kind of reflecting on it in this way is because that's the same thing with jazz, you know. When jazz is played at its best, it's when you're not trying to plan everything and try to control everything. It's more like you kind of ride the wave of wherever the thing's going. And that's universal. It doesn't only happen in jazz, it doesn't only happen in one particular art form. It's universal in that you can actually use that principle in everything in your life, and you'll see the momentum, because the default setting of life is really for your good, and it's really abundance, and it's really something far greater than what you can come up with, but you have to surrender to it. And that's how I got the opportunity to be at Manhattan School. It was literally through surrender. That's amazing. And funny enough, this is how meticulous and how detailed God plans your life, because before I heard about the scholarship, I actually played with Morris Goldberg at the Jazz Festival in 2019. That was the last time the Jazz Festival took place here in Cape Town. And he was at Manhattan School with Hugh Masekela in the 60s. In fact, they were best friends in the 60s. And he was telling me all these stories about Hugh and all these things, and how they went to Miriam Makeba's house when it was cold, because in New York it gets really cold in winter. And she cooked meals for them and she looked after them. And that was prior to Hugh Masekela and Miriam Makeba being married. It's just kind of a serendipitous moment, because that was 2-3 months before I had gone to New York. I'd played with him, he'd be telling me these stories. And then 3 months later, I was in New York at Manhattan School in a Hugh Masekela scholarship. And he was sitting in the audience at one of the concerts there, because he lives in Manhattan now. So what I'm trying to say is that everything actually works itself out when you get out of the way. And that God has a very specific plan for you. And it's bigger than what you can imagine if you allow him to work and if you surrender. And that's the very same thing here. This is just the channel for the same power. That's why jazz is so compelling, because there's actually an enormous amount of energy and power that you can bring through this thing if you have 4 or 5 people in a band surrendering. And I think it was for that reason that I was chosen in the audition, because I wasn't the best, technically speaking. I wasn't necessarily like even the demographic, because I didn't fit the mold of the kind of candidate that I think would have maybe gotten the scholarship, because there are a lot of people out there that could have gotten it, that may have been better or may have fitted the description of you know, I've had opportunities to study before. I haven't been a victim of poverty, and I haven't had a lack of opportunities. But that is nothing really to do with it. It has to do with whether you are actually being surrendering to your purpose in life. Because it doesn't matter where you come from, and it doesn't matter what your demographic is, and it doesn't matter. All of those things are superficial ways that man has constructed to understand something, which is far greater than that. So what I'm trying to say is that we should get rid of the labels and the boxes in our own minds. If an opportunity is meant for you, you'll always get it. It doesn't matter whether you're black, white. God trumps all of those man-made constructions, man. So that's the power of surrendering to God's purpose to your life. Because as I said, the default is to prosper you, to give you a hope and a future. And the more we are trying to control what that is, the more we actually get in the way of our own blessings. They did want to hear, Manhattan School in the audition wanted to hear something South African. And I think that's important, because it's important to be grounded and to be able to bring something to the table which is authentic, and I'm a South African. That's something different from what they have in New York, and I think it would be a disservice if I were not to bring some of that South African flavor to the party, you know, because that is part of who I am. So I think that it's important to recognize who you really are, and who you are has a lot to do with your background, has a lot to do with your experience, it has a lot to do with your roots and where you grew up. And so it's really about being honest and truthful and authentic. So I didn't really think about it really in that way. I didn't think about, oh, I have to bring something South African to the table, or I think that would happen naturally, because if I was honest with who I am and where I come from, it would just naturally be there. You know, if you're South African, you're going to hear the music a certain way. You're going to have certain influences which already exist in your experience, and you just need to learn to again get out of the way, and it will channel itself, you know. And if you're like an American, for instance, especially if coming from New York, there's like jazz on every corner. There's jazz like at the bakeries, there's jazz at every second pub. So that's part of who they are culturally speaking. And so what's really interesting is that you didn't try so hard in order to bring something different. You just need to be authentic, I think. I think that jazz is as many things as there are people, because you see, the word jazz is nuanced, it's not fixed. The amazing thing about jazz is it's more a representation of a whole host of other things. It's not confined only by one idea. It's a collective. The way I understand jazz, it's a group of ideas. And I heard a quote once that said that everything is jazz, but everything isn't jazz. And I think what the person meant by that is that, you know, jazz represents freedom. Let's talk about what jazz represents. It represents freedom. Why? Again, coming back to the origins, because in slavery, back in New Orleans, in the States, slaves weren't able to play music, I think, on any other day other than a Sunday. And they were oppressed on all the other days. So jazz was birthed out of people being able to allow their spirits and their freedom to be channeled through music. And so in Congo Square on a Sunday, they had the opportunity to beat on their drums and to dance and to sing. I think it was at lunchtime. And that actually was a vehicle for them to express their freedom and their humanity, because on all the other days they couldn't do that. So you could use jazz as a vehicle. You know, I'll give you an example. I watched a trumpet player play at a jazz club here in Cape Town, and someone was banging on the table while he was playing, and he got super frustrated, and he channeled that anger through his instrument. He started playing faster, he started playing louder. So it was a means of expressing something inside, you know, and he used his instrument as a vehicle to express himself. Slaves were given an opportunity to express their humanity and their frustration through the instruments at Congo Square in New Orleans, and that was where jazz originated in New Orleans. But it started with an expression of frustration and being able to be free through an instrument, because on every other day they were oppressed. So that's the origin of jazz. But because of that exact freedom that they had to express themselves, that thread of freedom has always been a fundamental cornerstone of what jazz is. So I think that based on that, jazz can never ever be defined by one person's idea, because the very fundamental origin of it is freedom, and freedom can't be something that you box in. You know what I'm saying? It can't be one-dimensional. It has to be dynamic. It has to be able to shift. That's one person's idea, and it sort of evolves and it changes. It's like metamorphosis, it's always becoming, it's never stagnant. So I think the closest thing that we're going to get to is you have to just know what the origins of jazz is, and you have to know the tradition. But that's just to inform where something is going. It's not supposed to keep it and hold it back from growing and evolving. Otherwise, it would be going against this very nature and its very reason for existence. And that's why it's so compelling, because it's a vehicle for the spirit to express itself, to stretch. It must stretch, we must grow, we must evolve. So jazz is, for me, it's not about whether it's a swing groove or whether it's a that groove or whether it's this. It's more about understanding a tradition and where something comes from, and being able to use that insight to develop your own voice. Basically to help people to also evolve and to give them a hope to be able to express themselves as an individual. Jazz will always have an African underpinning, because again, looking at the tradition, slaves were from Africa. And so rhythmically speaking, if you look at earlier jazz in the 30s and the 40s, that swing groove is a mix of 6/8 and 4. Ding, 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 ding. That groove is actually, its origins are in African music, the 6/8 part of it. So even there, it will always have ties to Africa, because rhythmically speaking, that's the one aspect, and harmonically speaking, obviously the blues was something that started in the cotton fields by Africans originally. So harmonically and rhythmically speaking, jazz will always have its roots in Africa. Well, in Cape Town, obviously you've got Guma. You've got Guma music, and again, origins are in oppression, and a means, if you look at the Cape minstrels and the coons and all that, that was also a means of expressing themselves through music. There was a playfulness to it, because when you're playful with something, you're allowed to make mistakes and you're allowed to be creative with it. So it's a vehicle for the human spirit to actually be free. Even if you look at that, the origins of Cape jazz are rooted in similar context. The Guma drum was a fundamental part of Cape Town music, and that filtered its way into what we call Cape jazz, for instance. But even if you look at the similarities between New Orleans and Cape Town, it was also port city, and there's also a melting pot, and there's also a lot of different cultures in one small space. What I'm trying to say is that all of these labels that we are giving it is really doing it a disservice when it comes to the spirit of the music, because the more we try to put an African label on it or this label on it, it's an illusion, man. We're trying to hold on to something which you can't hold on to, because its very essence of jazz is already a melting pot, it's already a mix. There's the Western classical aspect of it, harmonically speaking, but then there's also the blues, which is rooted in slavery. So yeah, I'm not really interested in labels. I think it's important to understand them. It's a construct for us to be able to learn, but then we have to get to a point where we're not thinking in terms of those things. Otherwise, we're never going to create something new. We're never going to allow each other to be free to express ourselves. And this is why you see that jazz has it's got almost like a hippie culture to it. You see the way people dress. They're really trying to express their freedom and their uniqueness and their independence, and that's for a very good reason. Because freedom is tied to love, is tied to trust. Because to love is to trust something and to surrender to it. Love is actually the core thing that brings a band together, resonating, because I'm not trying to overpower you with my solo. I'm taking the journey with you. I'm going with you. I'm missioning with you on this musical journey. I'm not trying to do my own agenda, and he's not trying to go his own way. And that's what makes a band coherent, because there's actually love. That's what's underpinning everything, actually. It's what's underpinning this whole universe that you're looking at.